Good morning and greetings, everybody, and welcome to the LAEJ Network's Enforcement Symposium, Environmental Justice Enforcement Symposium. My name is Ryan Michael Atencio. I'm with the California Resources Board. I'll be helping out today. We have a great program lined up for you today, but let me first start by sharing my screen. Because I have a few words that I need to mention at the outset here before we get into it in terms of interpretation. So, nomás unas palabras para ellos que ocupan servicio en español, interpretación. Estamos ofreciendo este servicio en tiempo real. Si ocupas este servicio de interpretación, favor en los controles de reunión, marca interpretación. Ese es el icono, el globito que aparezca en tu pantalla. Por favor, marca el idioma que le gustaría escuchar en ese icono allá abajo, por favor. If you require this kind of service for Spanish interpretation, we're offering that. Just go ahead and click on the globe icon in the bottom of your screen and you can follow the directions here. If you only want to hear the interpreted language, click on mute original audio. So again, thank you. And with that, in terms of the logistics as well, this meeting is being recorded, I should say. And I think I've hit the major points I wanted to hit. With that, I will pass it over to Robina Sewell. Robina, any words to welcome folks?
Hi, good morning and welcome. My name is Robina Sewell, and I'm the co-host of the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network's 7th Annual Environmental Enforcement Symposium. We'd like to thank our generous sponsors, Earth Justice, South Coast Air Quality Management District, the Office of the Los Angeles City Attorney, Los Angeles County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, and Los Angeles County Supervisor Janice Hahn. And a very special thank you to the California Air Resources Board for their absolutely phenomenal staff and technology support for the presentation today. The Los Angeles Environmental Justice Symposiums were created to bring regulators and the communities together to share the challenges that environmental justice communities face, and also to better understand the responsibility of each of the agencies who enforce environmental laws. For the past 6 years, our symposiums were held in person at the California Endowment, but due to this pandemic, we've shifted to a virtual platform. And we thank you so much for your enthusiastic response to our presentation today. Our attendees number well over 100 and represent cities throughout California and include parents, students, educators, K-12 and university representatives, union representatives, environmental justice advocacy groups, and members of the public. We also have more than 20 regulatory and enforcement agencies representing the city, the county, the state, and the federal government, whose responsibilities include, but are not limited to, protecting public health, our air, our water, and reducing toxic emissions. We're also honored to have local, state, and federal elected officials attending. We have the Office of Honorable Assembly Member Cristina Garcia, Speaker Anthony Rendon, Congressman Alan Lowenthal, and LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell. Today, you'll be hearing from some exceptional speakers who are not only extremely knowledgeable in their fields, but they're dedicated to making our world a better place today and for future generations. We encourage you to feel free to ask questions and share ideas, because when we can all work together toward a common goal with trust and respect, great things can and do happen. So thank you and enjoy the presentation, and back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Robina, for that great introduction. And again, this is the 7th annual Environmental Justice Enforcement Symposium. And if you remember, this is the second workshop in the series. The first workshop was held back in April, and it was titled Fabric of the Promise. This is Fabric of the Promise Part 2, Community and Government Conversation, Overview, Lessons, and Actions for AB 617 in Southern California. So we're going to be talking with the panel today on AB 617 from the community and governmental perspectives. The panel will cover background and overview of AB 617, lessons learned, actions for any course corrections, and conversations to move implementation forward. A little bit about the agenda before we hear from our panelists. We're going to have some panelist introductions, as I just mentioned, and then we're going to give some space for the statements, for opening statements from the panel members. And I should let you know, we have a great lineup. We have 6 panelists. So there's going to be opening statements, and we're going to be hearing from each of them. And there's this kind of dichotomy here that we wanted to include: government at CARB, and also the South Coast AQMD, also community folks. And then we're also going to have another part of the implementation folks in the AB 617 arena, the program, the incentive folks as it relates to incentives around AB 617. So we have a great panel lined up. We're excited about it, and then there'll be some discussion and some Q&A at towards the end of our program. And finally, we'll be closing out with any observations and some closing statements. And I should mention that we do have potentially a surprise guest. We wanted to tease that, so there might be a guest, and if they're able to join, we will notice them at that time. But I'll save that surprise for later. And I should say, in terms of the Q&A, we'll have some space for questions from the audience to the panelists, or in general, and we can address those questions to the most appropriate panelist. You can also type your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as well. Again, the conversation in the program is being recorded. And with that, I think we can kick off to our panelists' introductions, and we're going to be doing a round of self-introductions. With that, I'll kick it off to you, Deldi.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. Big shout out to you, Rabina and Cynthia, for conceiving of this symposium way back in the day and keeping it going despite all kinds of funding challenges, including those our own agencies contributed to. So you're warriors, and especially now, in the pandemic, also figuring out a way to make this happen. Just my kudos to you. So I'm Deldi Reyes. I'm 4 months into the role of serving as the director of the Office of Community Air Protection at the Air Resources Board. I'll tell you very quickly, I used to work as a federal employee at US EPA, where I had some experience working under the Federal Clean Air Act. And when I was in Region 9, working on environmental justice, when the blueprint conversations were starting to be had by CARB, and we began to learn at the federal level about what AB 617 had to offer, it was actually a very exciting time. It was inspiring to see that AB 617 was really attempting to flip the Clean Air Act on its head by really requiring air quality at the local scale. At the same time, working on environmental justice gave me an understanding of the deep critique that we were hearing about cap and trade in the moment. And so I took this job knowing the conflict that was in place at the time, and the sort of origin story of the law. Thanks.
Thank you, Deldi. One of Deldi's counterparts at the South Coast Air Quality Management District is also on our panel, and we're very happy to have him, Daniel Garcia. Dan, good morning. Did you want to say a few words?
Sure, I'll just be very brief, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Dan Garcia. I'm the AB617 Planning Manager for South Coast Air Quality Management District on AB617. So I think, I just do want to take this opportunity to particularly thank the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network really for allowing us to be a part of this conversation today. I think it's critical that we are a part of this conversation and are here really to listen and learn, as always, probably more than to just talk. And so I do want to thank you for that opportunity for allowing us to be here. I came to AB617 with nearly 2 decades experience in air quality, primarily on the regulatory front. And so I came to the AB617 program, particularly really with my heart set on making sure that we amplify community voices and that communities have a greater opportunity to be at the table when it comes to governance and making decisions about the impact on regulations and other kind of programs within air quality that impact their everyday life. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ryan.
Thank you, Dan, and great to see you again. I know we've seen each other at a lot of the community steering committee meetings, so great to have you on board. Thank you. I also mentioned the perspectives that we're offering here, the kind of the unique perspectives. So, with the focus on community, we wanted to have community folks part of the network to be able to, get those perspectives as well. So with that, I would like to introduce Jesse Marquez, if you wanted to say a few words, Jesse.
Hello, good morning to you all. Thank you very much for attending today's session. I am a lifetime resident of Wilmington, over 60 years. I'm also the founder and executive director of the Coalition for a Safe Environment. And I sit on the state consulting group advisory committee on the AB 617. And I'm also a member of the Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach, community advisory committee or community steering committee. And my role here is to share with you what are our concerns. And our concerns fall into the category of implementation, compliance, and enforcement. And I'll just give you a brief overview so you know what those concerns are. So as we go into each speaker and panelist, you know some of the things that we're expecting to hear, what they plan to do or what are the current activities and programs that will assure that, the AB 617 is a success. Well, beginning is that CARB has the ultimate responsibility for AB 617, and the local AQMDs have the local implementation responsibility. Our local disadvantaged communities and community steering committees, SERP goals, timelines, and metrics must be monitored. And that is a concern right there. All AB 617 requirements to identify, reduce, monitor, enforce stationary emissions from all sources, mobile emissions from all sources, as well as improve public health. In addition to AB 617, we have AB 32, which also has requirements to identify, reduce, monitor, and comply with the law. And that is the reduction of greenhouse gases from stationary and mobile sources. But where we begin from is that there can be no net increase from emissions from any CARB regulation or program. There can be no net increase from any AQMD rule or program. And there can be no net increase from any city, county, marine port, airport, et cetera, et cetera. And that is important to realize that whatever is being proposed, there cannot be any increase. It must decrease. And AB 617, AB 2 do not allow any government agency to issue an exemption, a waiver, or variance. Nowhere in the law does it mention any one of those three words, yet we see it being done. Even the governor issued an executive order waiving ships from having to plug into electric shore power. We do not believe he has that power.
Thank you. Thanks, Jesse, for that self-intro. I think there's going to be some space for some of this discussion. I want to get through the intros with your counterpart here from the network, Cynthia Babbage, and I think she might be indisposed, so we can go to our other two guests and then come back to Cynthia if she's available. Thanks, Jesse, though, for that intro. There will
Thank
be
you.
time. Yeah, thank you. I mentioned the kind of that perspective. Oh, it looks like Cynthia's available. So we'll go to your counterpart for the community perspective piece. Part of this discussion, Cynthia Babbage. Cynthia, a brief intro, self-intro, if you have one.
Certainly. I'm Cynthia Babbage. I'm the director of the Del Amo Action Committee. We're a small grassroots community group located in unincorporated Los Angeles County with many cumulative impacts of toxins. I'm also the coordinator of the LAEJ network. I've been doing this work for over 25 years. And I'm really looking forward to engaging with everybody and having the conversation. I appreciate the accolades earlier on for us, trying to pull things together to have these meetings. I do want to say that I think these meetings are important as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't be putting our efforts into them, but really creating this safe space so that we can learn from each other and teach each other as well. So I think that is like critically important. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Cynthia. I know you're super busy. Thanks for taking the time, as always. And I mentioned, again, we had, again, that third perspective in terms of the incentives and resources to toward this program, to support this program. So we wanted to get those perspectives because there are incentive funding for these actions as part of AB617. So with that, I wanted to see if Walter Shen had a brief introduction. Walter from the South Coast AQMD. Walter, pass it to you.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Walter Shen. I'm with South Coast AQMD. I am the Planning and Rules Manager, overseeing the Contracts and Outreach section in our Office of Technology Advancement. My background is incentives and has been for the past 6 years. I have over 20 years of experience at the South Coast AQMD, starting with enforcement and going into permitting and streamlining. So I'm happy to be here, happy to share any incentives information with the group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. And one of Walter's counterparts at the Air Resources Board, Derek Winters. Derek, a few words, self-introduction.
Thanks, Ryan. Derek Winters. I am work for CARB, and I am one of the lead staff for the community air protection incentives. So any incentive question that you have, hopefully I'll be able to answer today. That's it.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. You can see we have a packed program. We wanted to get some of these perspectives. And so, but I think we needed to start, and we all thought that we needed to start with a little bit of overview and background. And so we wanted to start with Deldi and Dan. So with that, let me turn it over to Deldi for a few words as part of her statement on the program that she is directing here at CARB. Deldi, pass it to you.
Thanks, Ryan. And I will say just right from the beginning, yes, the Office of Community Air Protection within CARB has a very key role in implementing AB617, but the way the law is written, it's really up to CARB, air districts, and communities to make this law function. And before I even show you the slide, I just want to get across this really central point. We know it's not perfect. The way the law was written is not perfect. In the implementation of it, we have realized what some of the inadequacies are, but we are doing our very best, and I know the air districts are as well, and I know communities are. They're doing much of this on their own time. It takes a lot of your time to participate in these community steering committee meetings. We realize that. Also, I will say, while much attention has been paid to the aspect of the program that has to do with selecting communities to be in the program, there are other very key elements of the law. The selection of those communities was really intended to allow us to understand what was working in some of these communities to drive down emissions and reduce exposures. And from those lessons to then apply to the hundreds of communities in California that are actually eligible to be in the program. That is our chief challenge right now at CARB and air districts as well, is to understand how we can make good on that. That is part of the promise. Let me go ahead and just share my screen and provide just a brief overview. I hope you all can see the screen. Each icon here really represents an area of emphasis that is addressed in the combination of the law or the blueprint. So if you're not familiar with the blueprint, it is the framework. It's the narrative written framework that translates what's in the law into, we hope, plain English that would allow both communities and air districts to be able to pick it up and understand how to implement the program. It is being updated right now. And we are very happy at CARB to say that it is being updated by a small group of community leaders who have been part of the program since its inception. We realized that, and they helped us realize this, that it was very important to shift the conversation about the blueprint, and that their views and experiences really needed to center the next part of the conversation. So they are working on a draft, which will then be the starting point for an updated blueprint that will get input, and conversation will be had at the level of our subcommittee, at the level of our consultation group. You heard Jesse mention he's represented on that consultation group. There are others as well. And then, of course, that includes air districts and industry are on that consultation group. And then at the public at large, we will have workshops on the blueprint. And to answer one of the questions, the way I see success for that particular aspect of our work is that when we go to the board in early 2022, we can say, this is the people's blueprint. Everything in it is a result of dialogue and consensus building across all of the stakeholders who need to make this program work. And I think that if the members of the writers group can look at that document and also see their views reflected and feel comfortable calling it the people's blueprint, that we will be successful. So that's one way of thinking about success specific to the blueprint. I don't have time to cover every element here. I'm going to lift up just a few. One, I want to speak to enforcement first. That's something Jesse mentioned. And one of the things that the law does, it's very specific in calling out existing authorities. CARB is the lead for implementing mobile source protections in the state. And so we are actually called on in the law to have enforcement elements as additional pieces to the community emission reduction plans. So every community that is selected to develop a plan does so in partnership with their air district, and CARB is there. We also have responsibilities to help reduce emissions, and we do that through a number of things, but it chiefly in terms of what the law calls for on us to do specifically, it's mobile source enforcement. Similarly, stationary sources are also called out in the law as being under the jurisdiction of the air districts. So enforcement is something we take very seriously at CARB. We work in close partnership with our enforcement division in CARB in how we support the work of the community steering committees. And Derek will be talking about the incentives piece. The other piece I want to talk about a little bit is partnerships. So partnerships with communities. As I've said, this law is intended to be implemented with CARB and air districts and communities. Communities need to center the work. And the plans are the vehicle through which community priorities can be included. I'll give you an example of this. The law talks about achieving reductions in emissions. That's the bread and butter work of air quality management agencies. And it drives all sorts of very, very critical needs to improve air quality across the state. How we meet targets in our state implementation plans, for example, for health-based criteria pollutants like PM 2.5 and ozone. But what I said earlier about flipping the Clean Air Act on its head, what 617 does is it requires us to throw everything we have at a community scale air quality challenge, right? And everything you see here in this graphic is an example of things that we could try to do to improve air quality. And so partnerships with communities is really central because that's how we make decisions about what's a priority and what gets put into the community emissions reduction plan. Now, there are different models of governance that we see in the 15 community steering committees that are in place right now. One of the ones that holds great promise is the model of co-leadership, where air districts and community leaders work together to identify what goes on your agenda, how your charters are shaped, how you navigate conflict. Those things are very central to decision making. So that's a model that we think is going to get lifted up in the blueprint update. Now, one other thing I just want to speak to, because it's an example of somewhat of an area in the law that could be strengthened, is this issue around collaborations with land use and transportation agencies. So the reason that collaboration is there is because the law does call on us to work with land use agencies, but it doesn't give us any authority to compel them. It doesn't give us any structure to incentivize them to come to the table. So we have to do that through the strength of the partnership, through the dynamic that we create within the community steering committee to bring other parties in who have resources, but who also have the responsibilities that can very much influence air quality, including impacting air quality negatively. And we need those folks at the table. So those are three examples of elements within the law under 617. Just in the interest of time, I think I'll stop here, but I'm happy to attempt to sort of share some of this information as I respond to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deldy, for that great overview. I wanted to give some space here to one of your counterparts at South Coast as well, who we heard from, Dan Garcia. Dan, anything you wanted to add here for your statement in this part of the program?
Sure, Ryan, thank you. I do want to, before I kind of get into my piece of the statement, I do want to thank Deldy for pointing out some of the challenges and highlighting some of the challenges that we have seen with AB617, but also highlighting some of the successes and how we can, really use some of that success story to improve, environmental justice issues within our environmental justice communities, particularly here in South Coast. So with that, I think, what I really kind of want to focus on, since Deldy kind of gave a broader perspective statewide of AB617 implementation, I do want to focus a little bit on our implementation efforts here in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. So I'll just provide a brief update on that implementation. So as many of you know, the AB617 statute has several elements to improve air quality and environmental justice communities throughout California. There's really three particular elements I think it is important to highlight. One is CARB's statewide strategy on reducing mobile source emissions, as well as the requirement for expedited best available retrofit control technology. This is really aimed at reducing NOx from stationary sources, as well as, of course, the community emission reduction plan element of the legislation that is intended to reduce emissions in our designated AB617 communities. So I'll really kind of cover a little bit on each of those elements. I think, really with respect to the BARC piece of legislation, I want to just, highlight that South Coast has been working on implementing the BARC requirements through rulemaking. This has involved amending about a dozen or so of our rules, and that specifically apply to refinery equipment, as well as to sources like, boilers and heaters and industrial furnaces. And with respect to the community emission reduction plan, or the SERPS element of the legislation, South Coast has now designated 6 environmental justice communities under AB617. And 5 of those communities our board has adopted community emission reduction plans for. We have worked really closely with communities over the last several years to develop these plans. I'd say we've had, over 100 community level meetings to develop these plans, and each plan does contain specific actions and does have specific emission reduction targets. I think that's really important to highlight, that's kind of the benchmark that we've set out in terms of the ultimate goal for these plans. And so, that kind of just gives you a brief overview of kind of the work that we've been doing under AB617. But before I conclude my statement, I do want to talk a little bit about how the AB617 program, at least from my perspective and from the district staff's perspective, has changed the way that we as a district have worked with communities to focus on community priorities. I think there's a couple of good examples I could point to, and particularly in this last year, One of the examples I want to point to on how we've really changed the way that we work with communities is the participatory budgeting process that we've implemented. I've been in government probably, like I said, nearly 20 years in my introduction. And I don't think I can ever recall a time where we, as a governmental agency, really set out a budget of nearly $37 million as a part of the AB617 incentive budgets, and really made a diligent effort to empower communities to decide where it was most valuable to invest these incentive dollars. So really trying to empower the communities to say, this is where we think it's most valuable to expend those dollars, and this is where it's going to help our community the most. And so for us in the last year, implementing that participatory budgeting process was new. It was a very different process to navigate. It required a lot of hard work, but I think it is, kind of what governance should look like. It's what we should strive for in governance, to make sure that communities have a greater voice in the decisions that they make and the decisions that are made to help improve air quality in those communities. I think the other thing I kind of want to point to is really our role in the AB617 program, in the ISR development, the indirect source rule development. That has been a huge success story for us in the last year. The indirect source rule was adopted. And I think the AB617 program really played a significant role in amplifying the community's voices and concerns within the indirect source rule development. I think when I look back, at least from my experience and working on the regulatory side of things, I can definitely say 20 years ago I would walk into a room full of regulators and working on really important things, particularly like rules that impact refineries, rules that impact agricultural burning, rules that impact major industrial sources. And I could say that maybe there were just one or two people that really looked like me in that room. And it always struck me because, from my perspective, I thought, but wait a minute, the communities that are often most impacted by these rules, why aren't they a part of this conversation? And so I think, one of the great successes of AB617 that we've seen is it's really leading us to a better place in terms of making sure that our communities are at the table and they're a part of the conversation around not only the rules that the agency puts in place, but also things like our incentive programs, our enforcement programs, and all of our outreach programs. And so I think when when I look at implementation over the last couple of years since the program has started, I think there's a lot to be said for that success in terms of bringing the communities to the table and making sure that their voices are amplified. And like I said, also making sure that they are very much a part of choosing and deciding where incentive dollars go within these communities. So with that, I'll kind of leave my statement at that and leave plenty of room for questions. But want to again thank everyone for this opportunity to kind of be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Dan, for that statement and that background, and thank you for your story. I think it's important that folks know the stories of the regulators as well. So thank you. Speaking of the community, we wanted to turn now to some folks that are part of the network and that are also, like I mentioned, we heard from them in the introductions, Jesse and Cynthia. Jesse, you were mentioning in your introduction, a couple of points. Did you want to mention anything else? Did you want to have a few words here as part of your opening statement?
Well, you must understand that, from our community perspective, we're looking for a healthier future for our children in our community. And we do have laws on the books now that require reductions. And many organizations such as ours, we conduct some of our own research We also will review government data as well. One of the things that we see constantly being omitted are requirements for the petroleum industry. Periodically, we do a trend analysis of emissions from our refineries, for example. And last week, we just completed a 20-year trend analysis of ConocoPhillips 66 oil refinery in Wilmington, and to determine where the existing laws, regulations, rules that are being implemented really significantly reducing these emissions. And what we discovered that many have not been reduced. In fact, many actually went up. Looking at benzene, for example, in the year 2000, benzene was at 728 pounds. And last year, 2020, it went up to 1,098 pounds. So how is a community able to have confidence in our agencies when we see emissions going up, not going down? And then, for example, the Port of LA has an environmental impact report for the BNSF SCIG project. They are not able to mitigate all the emissions that are being released from this project. So they have to include overriding considerations. Well, here's another situation where there's going to be a net increase emissions again from this project. And so we see CARB and we see AQMD having the responsibility to weigh in these environmental impact reports and state that there are laws on the books and you must comply with these laws. You cannot have a net increase in this project in this disadvantaged community. And so it's incumbent upon us to be able to review our rules and regulations to determine how effective are they. And if our organization can do a review of 6 refineries and determine that, at least, 20 or more different chemicals have actually gone up, they've not been decreased. And if we review the others, we find out there's probably about another 20 to 30% that have only had a minimum decrease. And that's not acceptable to us. We must be able to address those issues. And then, there cannot be any waivers. There cannot be any exemptions. There cannot be any variances for any project, for any contract, for any proposal. Agencies cannot change something that's in process. Port of LA had a green Omni terminal, and one of the components was a ship emissions capture technology that was supposed to reduce emissions significantly and also reduce greenhouse gases. Well, it failed. It cannot reduce greenhouse gases. Port turned around and asked CARB to accept that it cannot be done, and the contract was changed. However, there was a competing company, which is actually the patent holder, majority of patents on this technology, who does have new technology that can be incorporated into their system, which would reduce greenhouse gases. But we, the public, we attend these public meetings, we submit public comments, we submit documentation where we want to support a project, we want to support a program, but we will also identify what's missing, what is not acceptable, what are alternatives that can be incorporated into it. So many community residents, we have expertises from our jobs that we've done. Many residents also do their own independent research, and there are little community scientists out there researching technologies and alternatives. And then we have our organizations that are community-based that, over the past 20 years, we have evolved from zero knowledge on a lot of subjects to 100 plus, where we can meet with agencies and their staff one-to-one on a table to review a law, rule, or regulation, or a program, or any guideline, and be able to, how can we improve it? How can we make it success? And that's what we want to do. We want our programs to be successful, because what we have also learned, whenever new technologies have come into play, they have reduced emissions significantly. There are new zero emission technologies for almost every field right now that you can think of that can replace an existing, toxic emission source. We must embrace those. We cannot have incentive funds going towards near zero emission technologies when there are existing zero-emission technologies right now. There are 8 zero-emission Class 8 trucks that exist today that you can place an order today, and 12 months they will be delivered to you. That will meet all short haul requirements. So yes, they may not be able to go quite the 300-mile, 500-mile requirement, but when we're talking about low-income, disadvantaged environmental justice communities, and you have railroad yards and facilities, you have storage tank facilities that can all be serviced with these zero-emission trucks and vehicles, then they should be funded as the priority and be adopted now. And I'll stop for that right now.
Jesse, thank you. So certainly we want to be able to unpack some of those points. Thanks for that perspective. Before we turn it over to Cynthia, I did want to recognize Kim in the chat, Neistat. Kim, we have your question and we can circle back to that in the program when we get a chance. Thank you. And just a reminder, folks, questions that come up, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll get to those as we can in that part of the program. Cynthia, anything to add? There was an allusion to the incentives pieces here, which we'll hear shortly from, which is an important piece. Anything else to add here, Cynthia?
Yes, thank you. I come at this from a community perspective from a different angle. I think that, we have been identified at meeting the criteria for AB617, but we aren't part of a work group like Jesse is. And so the fabric of the promise, I just want to really remind people who already know, hopefully, and maybe those who don't, what are EJ impacts in the communities that are described as AB617? I mean, this is supposed to be a thoughtful approach at reaching the most polluted fence line communities that are already overburdened with pollution. And, the reason we're environmental justice communities most often is because we have less resources to protect ourselves. Often we can't move to a less polluted community, or that's our community. We don't want to have to be relocated. Home filtration systems are not something that are usually in our budget. Soundproofing and weatherproofing and stabilizing the impacts to our homes in these polluted communities doesn't often take place. There's no finances for that. Our healthcare, we're usually unable to protect ourselves like we would like to. We can't be as proactive as we wish. We have more exposure to toxins from not only the air, but from the water. And if you live in a contaminated community, probably the soil in your yard is contaminated as well. And so I think, that's a big problem. And then when we are so sick, it's really hard for us to plug into a system that we can afford that's proactive and really, takes it into stride. We have to plug into 7 layers before we can get to the acute emergency people, which is more than likely why we've ended up in the healthcare system. So I think in a nutshell, what I want people to know is that our EJ communities, we're hanging on by a thread. So the fabric of the promise for my community is that we don't die waiting for the burdens on our communities to be lifted. The current AB617 communities like Jesse's, they're doing the heavy lifting right now, along with a lot of you who are working in the program from your agencies and, helping to smooth out the process. And this too is really stressful. And that as well adds to the burden on our communities. Stress is a big health impact. And so what I've said before, and I will say again, is why we are taking the time to thoughtfully move through this process and to bring relief to our communities. There needs to be a moratorium. You can't keep adding to the burden, be it by the ways Jesse explained, because we have a problem and so we're going to bypass regulations that have been fought really hard to be put in place. We also can't have more trucking facilities, more warehouses, more scrap yards put into our communities while these processes are taking years and years to go through. That doesn't leave us any space for parks or green spaces or the green zone or the sustainability plans like we have in Los Angeles, they're never going to be implemented because everything is being taken up by all these bad actors, because they too see the writing on the wall. They see the regulations coming. They're not sitting there waiting to be regulated. They're moving forward, and they're going to get 25-year permits to continue to put the burden into our communities. And so I hear, Deldy, you know, what you were saying about land use, and we want to have those conversations. You know, DAC has expertise in the land use at this point. And what we see is that the local folks who you know have the jurisdiction are really looking to the other folks. So everybody's looking to everybody else. And in the meantime, we continue to have these things cited in our communities. And so the promise for us is that we don't die waiting.
Thank you, Cynthia. Powerful statement, and we appreciate that and your perspective here. And there's certainly a lot to get to in that statement, along with Jesse's, considering the backdrop of Dan and Deldy. I did want to bring in some folks from the governmental side on the incentives piece, because again, it's an important piece, and it was alluded to here, and it's part of the programming and a part of the process. So with that, I'd like to turn it over here to Walter Shen of, again, South Coast AQMD with the incentives team there. Walter, anything to add from the perspective of the incentives piece here to the dialogue?
Thank you, Ryan. And no, I appreciate the insight from the previous statements from the other panelists. So before I move on, for the interest of saving time, I will go through just a couple of slides. I'll share my screen, but I just wanted to reiterate that from the incentives group, we are in a collaborative spirit. We've been working very closely with Dan's group and ARB as well to ensure, thinking about Jesse's statement about the success of these programs, we're all reaching for the same goal. We are all striving for the same impacts and to minimize these burdens that Cynthia has been addressing. So, with that said, I believe that this incentives piece is a necessary resource for our goals and objectives. And with that said, let me share my screen so I could go through a couple of these incentives with the attendees today. So I just have less than a handful of slides, but basically this is, as you, I'm hoping everyone could see.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, we can see the screen. Yes, thanks, Walter.
Yeah, my apologies. So just diving straight in, this table is just highlighting perhaps some of the most popular incentive programs that we have to offer at the district. For the interest of saving time, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these slides together, all these slides and the details, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. They're in order by alphabet, right? So there's no priority on any of these programs. However, the way it's organized is the description of these incentive programs, some of the high-level funding details, and useful links and info in case any of you or the attendees would like that extra detail. But I want to just highlight some of the most popular programs and what are open for solicitation today. So the first line you will see is the Carl Moyer program. It just closed earlier this month, and this is one of our oldest incentive programs, and it's going on its 23rd year of implementation. So as indicated in the description, the focus is the focus on the replacement of older heavy duty, not light duty, but heavy duty on-road and off-road engines and equipment. And under this program, the funding can be up to 85% of the total costs. And approximately, it could range anywhere from 30 to 35 million annually. This is overly subscribed on an annual basis. So this is one of our most popular ones and the oldest one. Replace Your Ride, lower on the table. That is another popular program, and that provides incentives up to $9,500 for the purchase of a light duty vehicle from participating dealerships in our region. So moving on to what's currently open. So right now we're accepting applications, or I'm sorry, Right now, the program for the voucher incentive program, the last line on this table, that is a voucher-based program where we work with participating dealerships to provide the point of sale rebates, if you will, for the purchase of cleaner trucks, heavy duty on-road trucks focusing on small fleets. And these are fleets of 10 or less, or companies with fleets of 10 or less heavy duty trucks. Funding will be up to 125,000 for the replacement of these older diesel trucks here. So also opening for solicitation later this month, or actually next week on June 22nd, is the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust. This latest solicitation will have $26 million available for the replacement of Class 7, Class 8 freight trucks, as well as other combustion freight and marine projects. So there are other programs on this table that will serve to benefit the community and the air pollution on this region. But just tying all the programs together on this table, these incentive programs will require the participants to scrap their old vehicles and equipment. So that's kind of one of the commonalities amongst all these incentive programs. And many of these do focus on prioritizing projects in DAC and EJ areas. And I will also like to highlight that our programs do provide incentives onto a wide range of equipment. So on this table, what I didn't cover was that we cover heavy duty to light duty vehicles, as well as your small off-road equipment such as lawn and garden equipment as well. So this slide, I'm not going to, again, in the interest of saving time, is just a higher level representation of the benefits of some of our programs. So using Carl Moyer as an example, being one of our oldest programs, we have turned over or funded up to or close to 8,000 vehicles. And the emissions reduced is approximately 8,600 tons per year of NOx for the region. And there are other details from the other different kinds of incentive programs on this slide, but again, I just wanted to highlight the Carl Moyer program. And this last slide is just to show, this last slide is just to show, oh, I'm sorry about that. It's a little delay on my end here. Yeah, this last slide is just to show some images on, I hope everyone could see that, bear with me here. Just to show some images of the kinds of heavy duty equipment that we do fund under a lot of our incentive programs. So with that said, I just wanted to focus and circle back with everyone that these are some of the incentive programs that our district has to offer. And I'll be willing to answer any additional questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Walter. And yeah, your technology was working. We saw your slides and the types of equipment that is funded. Thank you for that perspective. Really, well, to turn it over to your counterpart at CARB here to close out the perspectives from the incentive pieces. I want to hand it over to Derek. Derek, did you have anything to add at this time and part of your statement?
Thanks, Ryan. Just a little bit. And thank you for everyone that went before. It makes my job a little easier. I just fill in the gaps a little bit. So incentives, what's an incentive? I'm going to speak a little bit about that, the history of the incentives for CAP, the Community Air Protection Program, excuse me, sorry about that. And then what does success look like for an incentives perspective? So what's an incentive? We've heard, regulations. Well, an incentive will not pay for compliance. Incentive will pay for above and beyond reduction that would not otherwise be seen by regulation. So, future stuff. A little bit of the history for the community air protection incentives is in 2018, that's when we got the first installment of funds. And to get some early actions, we kind of just had the Moyer supplement where, like what Walter was just describing about the Carl Moyer program, where a lot of projects could be funneled through that program just for early actions. In 2019, that's when CARB staff got together and we actually put together a chapter, 2 chapters or so, where you could actually fund different projects that were not in existence before, like composite wood products at school, zero emission lawn and garden projects at school, air filtration systems at schools again, and transportation projects in general, but then also the hex chrome that is seen throughout the state, just metal processing facilities. In 2020, after some feedback that we received from the community and the air districts, we decided to install another chapter that pretty much just opened it up. Instead of having these, predestined chapters, we have, a flexibility chapter, a sense, where, the chapter is broken down into 2 different segments. One that, for communities that have community steering committees or communities that have to form a community emission reduction program or SERP, and then other communities that just receive CAP funds. So we open it up where you can pretty much, as long as you follow the framework that we put in that chapter, you can fund anything that has an air quality nexus. There's a stationary source side that's for all the communities that don't have a community steering committee and have to do the community emission reductions program. Or and then the community identified projects where it can be stationary or mobile, and pretty much it's anything that the community sees as a benefit, to allow them to have cleaner air. I particularly think the community identified projects are going to be something that the community is going to see going forward throughout the other communities, like what Deldy mentioned, how the CAP program is essentially like a starter to make sure that we address the emissions, the poor emissions at the community level throughout the whole state. So right now we're experimenting with the selected community, but we're hopefully going to expand that to all the communities. And then, so I want to move into what does success look like? I've told you what incentive is, the history of incentives, and then what does success look like from the perspective of incentives? Personally, let's take a second here. I asked myself this question, and then, without, saying my answer to my management, I wanted to see what they said about what does success look like. And, not to my surprise, maybe to yours, those answers were very similar. I want to say, preface that by saying, I'm one of those people that are from an affected community, not a selected community, but someone who could benefit from a program like this and has benefited from similar programs to get, disadvantaged youth into better circumstances. So it was good to hear that. But what does success look like? From an incentives standpoint, it's supporting innovative decisions that support the community and lead to a zero emission future. Zero emission is here, it's now, it's exactly what Jesse was saying. I can speak a little bit about, to the, we've recently just opened up, a program, the Hybrid and Zero Emission Truck and Voucher Incentive Project, the HVIB, as you may commonly hear that. That recently just opened up, and within 4 hours, you had $89 million go in these type of zero emission type of projects. So the need's there, everyone sees it, and the technology is there. So what's happening on the ground? Well, just recently from the South Coast region, we actually have had one of the community identified projects that was submitted from South Coast actually get approved. So change is happening on the ground. But also what I want to say is, just want to give a little bit perspective about the types of projects that you can actually fund with the community identified project. Because that new Hex Chrome, we do have, like I mentioned earlier, we do have an existing chapter for Hex Chrome, and the community was able to, chat with the air district and say, hey, we actually want to amend some of the requirements in that. And that's what a community identified project is. From the community to the air district, you communicate what you want to see, and the air district, can make it happen if it has an air quality nexus and follows that framework. So that new Hex Chrome, pretty much it allowed for small businesses to get 100% of funding for an installation of a new Hex Chrome system. I mean, to me, that sounds awesome, especially for a small business that might not be able to afford this change. So I want to let you know, the community and all those that can hear, the types of projects. So one that I've heard at a previous South Coast event was they want to fund an owner operator truck, but also the trailer part of that. And I want to let you know that's a good project in our eyes. And that's something that, we definitely want to champion and want to see more of. So any type of idea that you have, as long as it has an air quality nexus and it has some tie, speaking to the South Coast communities that have a steering committee, as long as there's a tie to the community emission reduction program, the SERP, then it is fundable. So you just have to make sure that, you communicate this to the South Coast and we can get it funded. That's pretty much I have. I am going to drop in the chat a email that if you have any questions, you can, this email is not my personal email, but it's going to go to an email that I have access to. If you have any questions related to incentives about AB617, go ahead and shoot us an email. We'll give you a response. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek and Walter. That was very informative, and thanks for Derek adding that that address where folks can follow up with some questions. So yeah, we've come to the part of the program, right before we open it up to, kind of open discussion and Q&A. There was a couple of things in those 6 statements. There was a lot to unpack there, from the overview to the very specific community perspectives to the resources potentially available that Walter and Derek were speaking on. So I wanted to get a few general follow-up points to 1 or 2 of the panelists, because there's really condensed discussion here, and we want to make this useful for the most amount of folks on the line. But Derek ended his statement, and maybe I should start with Dan and Deldy, so this can be for either of you. Derek ended talking about SERPs and how the incentives, the success for the incentives that he and Walter are speaking on in terms of the CAP funding. The success would be those incentives supporting those strategies in those communities, selected communities. I'm wondering if we could just say a few words on, we keep saying this acronym SERPs, Community Mission Reduction Programs, and we shouldn't use the acronyms right in these generalized settings, because sometimes we all don't speak the same acronym language. So maybe Deldy and Dan, if you wanted to say a few words on the SERP, and then is that, in your eyes, is that connection, that programmatic connection, is that also follow for you in terms of what success looks like with CAP funding specific strategies, or is it something else? That might be useful, and then we can follow up with some of the specific community pieces that Cynthia and Jesse raised. So I don't know, Deldy or Daniel, if you have any response to that part.
Dan, feel free to go for it, and I can certainly add in.
Sure. I think, when we talk about, when you talk about the word success, Ryan and the other panel members, I think from my perspective, at least, and from the district's perspective, really, what success really looks like is making sure that we follow through on the original goals and that we set out to achieve. And a significant, piece of that is really about emission reductions. And so, I think that's where I think the community has, all the communities across, the district have a number of concerns, but I think most importantly, they're really focused on emission reductions and exposure reductions. And I think that's the piece that, to me, is when we talk about success, is if in 5+ years we look back and we can point to emission reductions and exposure reductions, that would be a really solid benchmark, I think, for success. I think what I would add to that is that when you tie in things like incentive programs, those programs do contribute to emission reductions, and so that is a part of what would be a success story. And so I think for me and for the program that we are kind of leading here at South Coast with our community partners, I think emission and exposure reduction is key to that success. And as I mentioned before, making sure that throughout the implementation of this program, that the communities have a seat at the table, and making sure that their voices are really part of the larger conversation on how we move towards improving air quality in the South Coast Air Basin and in the parts of the Eastern Coachella Valley that we're focused on.
Thank you, Dan. Deldy, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say thank you so much for that, Dan, and Cynthia for your earlier comments, and Derek for your great information. To me, it really just reminds us of the overall challenge here. As Cynthia says, the promise is, how do we protect our communities? How do we keep our communities from dying, right? Air pollution kills. And while under AB 617, we have a model for how we can do this work one community at a time, we do know that at the current pace of selecting a few communities per year with the limited resources we have, it's not going to do the job. So the idea that we need to make use of every dollar we can get, every authority we can get, every agreement we can make with other entities, that that's really our charge. So how can we use incentive dollars in more creative ways to address community concerns that are coming from communities that are not, quote, in the program, right? I think that's the next wave of how we try to maximize impacts under air quality protection in general. AB 617 is certainly not the answer to everything, right? We need to think about every other authority we also have. I'll just close by saying too, each of those plans for CARB, we now have 15 community steering committees in the program. Of the 15, 11 of them have a district approved emission reduction plans, and will shortly, all of them will be approved or considered by the CARB board too. Every plan represents really for CARB an 11-year commitment. Year one is about the community steering committee developing their plan. And yes, that's an insanely unrealistic timeline in 12 months to require the plan to be developed. That's what the law tells us to do. 5 years for implementation of what's in the plan, another 5 years to really evaluate the progress. Is it holding steady? What else do we need to be doing? So it's a long-term commitment for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Deldy and Dan. Somebody, it sounded like somebody had a question, but if I did want to circle back with Jesse and Cynthia, because we heard the decision makers at the governmental agencies, and then we heard the incentive folks, on either side of your statements and the points that you brought up. We heard some clarification on the emission reduction plans and incentives that go toward those strategies. So either Jesse or Cynthia, like Jesse, when you're talking about zero emission vehicles, heavy duty in your example or in your commentary, when you're talking about things like this, can you talk about, I think I know the answer, but number one, what would success look like to you and your community in terms of a zero emission future? But number two, and related to the resources piece and the incentives piece, is there a commonality there? Is there a there where these resources can line up with your expectations? And I'll pass it to you, Jesse.
Well, the first thing to understand is that the communities we're understanding, we realize that everything cannot be done overnight, but we do know and realize that we can have a phase-in plan whereby we can determine, okay, what can be accomplished in the first 3 months, the first 6 months, the first year. We understand that and we can accept that as long as we stay on course. The other reality too is that we understand that everything takes funding. And now that we're asking industries to make a transition, industries must realize that, we will do the best that we can support you in those transitions. And providing incentive funds is one of those categories. But then part of that money is not only coming from, industry, it's coming from the public, but then we realize that, who are also users of these freight transportation technologies that should also be involved in contributing funds. So now we're talking about big box retailers such as, your Walmarts, your Kmarts, your Home Depots, where they're all importing products and having to use our freight transportation system. Well, yes, they may pay tax gases, but then the tax gases that they're paying are not adequate to offset the impacts they're having, because, Long Beach had built the Jessamine Bridge for $360 million way back then, but then the cost to replace it was over $1 billion to replace it. And then it was paid 100% by the Port of Long Beach. Port of Long Beach decided to donate it to Caltrans. And once it's donated to Caltrans, then all of the California public now pays the majority of that bill. So ports in the past, the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach, have used a container fee. We've asked for legislation to try to get passed to support that. And when we're talking about fees, again, it's only a temporary assessment in order to transition that, because we know about trucks as well. We've talked with the Port of LA and we've talked with other officials where they've told us the typical lifespan, for a heavy duty truck is 7 years. And we also know that it's a tax write-off every year as well. Okay, so there are benefits to the truck owner. But then if there's going to be a turnover every 8 years or so, then, we only need to have an incentive fund up to a certain point in time. We can call it 7 years, we can call it 10 years, but then, we don't want to have the truck driver necessarily be charged this fee. It has to be who commissioned that truck driver and that truck. So then again, it falls back to, your big box retailers that are majority of all the transportation forwarding that's happening there. They have to be given that tax or that assessment in order to help balance the transition. And then we can also participate in what are the priority projects. So yes, if there's going to be incentives going towards a community, well, the priority of funding will be for trucks or truck companies that are going to service the nearby facilities. As we're talking about West Long Beach, South Carson, and Wilmington that are fence line to these facilities. So therefore, the ports and industry and government agencies have to realize that, we want funding to go to all these short hauls. So this case would be the Union Pacific ICTF. It'd be the East LA and Commerce, Union Pacific and Business Railroad yards, as well as any other proposed ones. The trucks must service the local communities first. And so there's where we weigh in as towards the priority, and we've gotten no commitments to make that happen. Yet, if you want to get a project approved, that's what we're asking, that, you dedicate certain fleets. Now, maybe not every fleet wants to do that, that's fine. But then I'm sure we can find volunteer truck companies who would be willing to service only these, or allocate a certain percentage to service only these facilities, which are our priority communities. And then even looking at the technologies, again, there are over 100 environmental justice communities in the state of California. All 100 plus are in complete unison. We want zero emission transportation technologies. No investment in anything else. So all we have right now at this time are your battery, lithium type batteries, but then we also have your hydrogen fuel cells, which are the big promising, future for the long hauls. But we already recognize that. And we are already, our organization prepares periodically, survey updates of all transportation vehicles, all construction companies, construction vehicles and equipment, as well as, your passenger and freight type transportation vehicles. So we are monitoring that, and we are publishing these reports as to what have we found. And these are the types of information we will submit as part of our public comments whenever there's no new rules and regulations, whenever there's no EIRs that come out for whatever project. And we expect the agencies to be able to review these documents, and when they make their decisions, that they incorporate these technologies so that we do have the best benefit. And we've also looked at, what are your best available control technologies? They're not all being incorporated in all the industries where they should be. And again, that falls back into regulatory agencies and, We've identified, AQMDs that are not in compliance, so we expect CARB to be able to do it. And in some cases, if we find fault in CARB, then maybe Cal EPA or the Attorney General must be brought into the picture. But we don't want to have to go to those extremes. We want to be able to work as partners in resolving the problems in our community. And our organization and our members and our researchers and our scientists and professors that work with us are all resources available to you. And we, at any point in time, we will respond and we will participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, for that. And we have been joined by our secret special guest, surprise guest. Before I introduce him, I think Cynthia, I wanted him to hear this. Cynthia had something related, and just to get back to the commentary on how the strategies and the incentive funds. Cynthia, did you have something before we introduce our surprise guest?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just want to say that, what success looks like to us is to really stop the bleeding out of our communities. I am not a broken record, but I really want to bring the balance to the conversation and the urgency of the matters that are at hand. And I appreciate Jesse's words. We are patient. We know things take time, but there's a limit to our patience. And I can tell you what success does not look like: adding more pollution to our already overburdened communities. So we already have situations that are in our communities, and the incentives program to me is to help them come into better compliance, to make things better. But while those incentives are going, and we already have a plus, let's say, for our community with our existing burdens, why we sit here and wait, we get 2 more pluses by more warehouses and more trucking facilities being added to the burden. Then with the incentives programs, maybe you're going to have a minus, and that's really great. But still, now, instead of the 1 plus you started off with, now you have 2 more pluses, and pluses representing the burden. So, a moratorium is not even on the table. Everything is so geared towards businesses and making things happen that nobody says stop. And I think if you go back and you look at the discussion before there was an AB617 and AB32, however many numbers you want to give us, it doesn't matter, because what we were telling you is stop. We need buffer zones. So the conversation of stopping and giving us chance to breathe and creating buffer zones has turned into a lot of different processes that are supposed to lead us to the same spot. So I really encourage the agencies to get that on the table. It's hard. Yes, I know it's hard to say no, but you're saying no to us all the time. When we watch people in our neighborhoods lose our legs, because of diabetes from the impacts, we know enough already. And, let's put those dollars to use and say no more. That's what success will look like to me, is when I don't have to spend my small capacity fighting yet another warehouse coming into my tiny little community. We're all going to be dead.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think there was a little bit of delay there at the end, but we got you loud and clear on the burdens, for sure, tying into Jesse and your earlier commentary. So at this time, also wanted to take a moment here as we are getting towards the end of our programming for this workshop to introduce our special guest, Mr. Gideon Krakoff, board member in common for South Coast AQMD and the Air Resources Board. Board member Krakoff, thank you so much.
Keep it short, Ryan.
Thank you. No, you go for it. I was, fighting out of the blue corner, 200 pounds, 5'10". What do you got?
Well, I've been participating in, I think, this symposium. I don't know how many years it's been, Cynthia. I am a little upset at you, Ryan. You said I did not have to come right after Jesse and Cynthia. So tough acts to follow here. And I'm coming in late, and I've got an 11:30 meeting, so I apologize. And I don't know if Derek and Walter have already spoken. I know they were on the agenda, and good to see Dan and from AQMD and Deldy. And of course you, Ryan, I've worked with for probably 15 years. And I see you too as well, Crystal. So thank you all. I have the privilege of serving the governor both on the AQMD board and the CARB board. The 617 program in all of its elements, which includes the community protection programs and the SERPs. It includes the technology clearinghouse. It includes our BART rules. Is undoubtedly a key component of the work that I need to do in both of these roles. And it is undoubted that this is going to be a priority for the work that I do. So I'm working very closely with Deldy and with Dan and the other folks on the programs. For me, the idea behind 617 is emissions reductions in the 617 communities. I think that was the deal and the goal that was struck as part of the 2/3 reauthorization in connection with AB 398 and 617. And my goal is to see that happen in reality, emissions reductions in these communities, based on actual modeling. So, I feel like we're still just starting out, but I think we have to hold ourselves accountable as AQMD and CARB board members to see that through, to not just approve, for example, the SERPs, but actually to implement them. So I'm very proud at the South Coast that we just got through our indirect source rule for warehouses, which is a key component of many of the different SERPs. There's a host of other rules and things that we've promised to do in approving these plans. Jesse, of course, knows this, and the Carson-Wilmington SERP, a host of things. So this is not easy. It's a work in progress, to be sure, but my goal is to try to hold ourselves accountable to the intent and spirit of 617, which is emissions reductions on top of the other normal programs, which of course are also quite aggressive, and to see that all the elements of 617 are carried through and that we're holding ourselves to account. So that's a big job. It's going to be a big priority for my work. I'm sorry to have missed the folks that spoke before me. There's so much time and effort going into this program. Dan and Joe Kay's staff at the district are just, Walter I know is here, are just working so hard on this. So much time is going in. Deldy and the folks at CARB as well. So much time is going into this. And my expectation and hope is if together we can collectively demonstrate that the program is successful, that it is working, then the folks that fund the program in the legislature and helped create the program are going to want to continue to support those efforts, and that this can be sort of a positive feedback loop where the program was envisioned, the program is implementing and working. Folks are going to want to fund the program, and when we fund the program, we can continue to make it successful. So I know that there are stakeholders that are unsure. I think the jury is still out, but the program is in the books. We're working really hard on it. And again, one of my goals, and I know that the folks at CARB and South Coast and the other air districts too want to see the program be successful, but it's going to take all of our efforts, all of our collective input on this, the pushing, the strategic implementation. It's going to really take a village to make this program successful.
Thank you, Gideon. Here, just in order to wrap up the program, we wanted to start to hit on some of the questions in the Q&A, so it's good that everybody is here for this part. The first couple of questions were from Kim Neistat. Kim, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but she had a couple of questions. Number one, and I think I'm going to lob this to Dan Garcia if I can. Kim was asking, how does a particular community get picked to be in the AB617 program? And a follow-up question was, what can an individual citizen do?
Yeah, so Ryan, I think I did put a link to kind of how you can, from our air district at least, how you can become an AB617 community. So I did drop that into the chat, and I believe Crystal from CARB also dropped a piece in from CARB. I would, to that particular question from Kim, I would say definitely visit those websites and take a look at kind of what that process entails. And then I think the question on, it's not quite clear to me on what she means by what can an individual citizen do. Could we get clarification on that question?
Sure. Just maybe to help make it more efficient here, maybe I can suppose what it was, unless she wants to add. But maybe it's something like, if there is a person in a resident that lives in a community that, if they're not selected yet, obviously they can look at that information and see how that process works. And then maybe you can talk a little bit about, for folks that are part of a community that does get selected, like what is the structure there to give input to the district and to CARB?
Yeah, so certainly, I think the most, like any other community kind of driven program, I would say the most important thing really is participation. And I don't mean, we recognize that we are working in communities that are already heavily burdened by a number of things, right? And particularly looking at the last year, burdened by, this global pandemic in a way that many other communities were not burdened. So we recognize that this program, requires a level of community participation that oftentimes not every community member has the opportunity to provide, to attend every meeting, to raise every single issue to us. So I think, what's important to keep in mind is that any input from any concern that any community member has in these 617 communities is important to raise that to us, whether it's by an email, give us a call, or even to share amongst your other community members to raise that level of awareness, because maybe that's a concern that your neighbor has, or maybe that's a concern that you cannot express to us, but that your neighbor can on some level. So I think, just what I mean by participation is that any community member making sure that they express their concerns within their community and take any opportunity, to reach out to us on any level. Not everyone has time to participate in the 2-hour meeting, and we recognize that. And so, we really on our outreach front try to do as much outreach as possible, making even individual phone calls, emails, and all sorts of different types of outreach. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that, and that we make sure that any community member, regardless if they're a CSC member or not, feels the freedom to give us a call and express any little particular issue that they might have concern about.
Thank you, Dan. And of course, there's, I think you were alluding to, and there's always that structure in the selected communities of the community steering committee, and that whole process. So I think that would be something for Kim. And then Kim, just closing it out. We're wrapping up here. We're actually at time limit. There's other resources out there, Kim, for communities that are not necessarily selected, and we're going to drop some of those in the chat. Of course, the old school resource is to contact somebody either by phone or email, and I'm happy to be that contact for folks that have any questions for CARB. I'll drop my information, or somebody will, in the chat, so feel free, and we'll continue to run that chat after the meeting just to close it out. And then this entire program is being recorded, and so you will have access to that info subsequent. So with that, closing thoughts, I just want to thank the panelists and the guests. A lot here to go over, to unpack. I thought there was a lot of conversation here that was useful, a lot to dig into, and certainly some things in terms of the burdens, certainly some things in terms of connecting the dots to a zero emission future from the perspective of the community, the expectations and the hopes of the communities. And so thank you, Jesse and Cynthia. Robina, did you want to close us out for the network?
Hi, thank you. I just want to express on behalf of Cynthia and myself, tremendous thanks to our moderator, Ryan. You did an exceptional job, and all of our inspirational speakers, the CARB technical support, especially Crystal Lazard. And special thanks to our translators who often are not thanked enough. Thank you so very much. And of course, to all of the attendees who took time out of your very busy schedule to attend. We're going to be continuing our Environmental Enforcement Symposium presentations the third Wednesday of the month through December. And we hope you'll join us then. We have, thank you for placing it. It's right on the screen right now. July, we have transportation infrastructure. In August, new avenues of enforcement. September, pesticide regulations and enforcement. October, sustainability and land use plans. And in November, policy and environmental enforcement. And in December, environmental justice community stories. Thank you very, very much.
Great. And with that, I think we're going to close it out. Thank you for joining. We're at time. We'll see you next time, folks. Have a great day and a great week. Bye-bye.